How COVID Stole Christmas.
Every staff member in Bath liked Christmas a lot, but COVID, who lived in the shadows, did not. COVID hated Christmas the whole Christmas season. Now please don't ask why, no one quite knows the reason. It could be that his spikes weren't screwed on just right. It could be, perhaps, that his minions were too much of a fright. But I think that the most likely reason of all may have been that this virus was a result of the fall.
Whatever the reason, his spikes or the fall, he stood there on Christmas, hating it all, staring up from the ground with a sour COVID frown at the warm lights of Christmas that lit up the town. For he knew every staff member, from Jeff Harmon to Keith, was busy now hanging a mistletoe wreath. "And they're planning events," he snarled with a sneer. "Tomorrow is Christmas. It's practically here." Then he growled with his COVID fingers nervously drumming, "I must find some way to stop Christmas from coming."
For tomorrow he knew all the staff and employees would wake bright and early, filled with much poise. And then, oh the joys, oh the joys, 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 joys. That was one thing he hated, their joys.
Then the employees, the young and the old, would sit down to a feast, and they'd feast, and they'd feast, and they'd feast, 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 feast. They would feast on Barbara Sue's pastries and Finlayson's grilled chicken, which was something that COVID wished was forbidden.
And then they'd do something he'd like least of all. Every employee, the tall and the small, would stand social distance with Dave's cymbals ringing. They'd stand social distance, and the employees would start singing. And they'd sing, and they'd sing, and they'd sing, 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 sing. And the more COVID thought of this family life sing, the more COVID thought, I must stop this whole thing. Why, for 60 plus years I've put up with it now. I must stop their joy from coming. But how? Then COVID got an idea. An awful idea. COVID got a wonderful, awful idea.
"I know just what to do," COVID laughed into his coat. "I'll make a quick plague that will sicken their throat." And he chuckled and clucked. "What a great COVID trick! With this virus and this quarantine, I'll make them all sick. All I need is a carrier." And COVID looked around, but with Clorox and masks, there was none to be found. So he called his friend Air. Then he took some red plague, and he spread it on thick, on top of Air's head.
Then he loaded up some infection in a positive test on a current of air that was sure to do the rest. Then COVID said, "Giddy up!" and the current started down towards the gym floor where the staff could be found. The employees were praying with all their heads bowed when the virus settled on the first of the crowd. "This is stop number 1, the old COVID virus hissed, and he entered their system with evil in his fist. Then he slid into their immune system, a rather tight fit, for they had been washing their hands quite a bit. Then he stuck his virus right into their nose. "These sinuses," he grinned, "are the first things to go." Then he slithered and slunk with a smile most displaced, and he took every last part of their taste. Salty and sweet, sour and bitter, he even caused them to lose the use of their smeller. Then he slunk to their lungs and caused them to cough. He filled them with fluid as if they were a trough. And he crept to their forehead, that nasty old fellow, and gave them a fever that caused them to shiver.
Then COVID grabbed the virus, and he started to scheme, when he heard behind him a terrifying scream. He turned around fast, and he saw Vitamin C, who was preparing to fight like young Bruce Lee. COVID had been caught by this small supplement that looked like it was ready to lay down punishment. C stared at the virus and said, "COVID, Why? Why are you taking our Christmas joy? Why? But you know that old COVID was so smart and so slick. He thought up a lie and he thought it up quick. Why, my vitamin friend, the virus lied, there's a present right here that I'm leaving inside. So I'm taking my friends and I'm spreading some cheer. I'll fix them up well for all to hear. And this fib fooled the vitamin, and COVID patted his head, then turned around quickly and kicked him instead.
When Vitamin C went flying so far, COVID picked up his things and got in his car. Then the last thing he left was cramps and a body ache. Then he hurried on his way to cause a giant outbreak. And all that he left was some fear and headaches. And the one speck of hope that he left in their house was that they could be sick with their loved one or spouse. Then he did the same thing with all their friends' houses, but some of them didn't get sick with their spouses.
It was a few days to Christmas. Many employees filled with dread. When COVID packed up his things and continued to spread to their lungs, the forehead, the back, the knees, and the sinus, the six-pack, the toe crack.
3,000 feet up into the air COVID flew. He sailed with his virus to see what they would do. Lots of strife to family life, he was happily humming. They're finding out now that contact tracers are coming. They're taking their calls. I know just what they'll do. Their mouths will hang open, those smug little staffers. Then all their crying will be drowned with our laughter. That is a noise, grinned COVID, that I must hear. So COVID paused and put a hand to his ear. And he did hear a sound rising over the snow. It started out low, and it started to grow.
But the sound wasn't sad. Why, this sound sounded merry. It couldn't be so. But it was merry. Very. He stared down at Earth, and COVID popped his eyes. Then he shook. What he saw was a shocking surprise. Every employee in FLN, the tall and the small, was filled with some joy without presents at all. He hadn't stopped joy from coming. It came. Somehow or other, it came just the same. And COVID stood there puzzling with his virus strong grasp, stood puzzling and puzzling. Should I let out a gasp? It came without family. It came without friends. It came without gems. Then he puzzled 3 hours until his puzzler was sore. Then COVID thought of something he hadn't before. Maybe joy, COVID thought, means a little bit more.
And what happened then? Well, at FLN, they say, they realized that true joy comes from the baby boy. Though they missed their families and presents and fun, they found there was more time to focus on the one who loved them no matter the date, the one who brought life and destroyed all the hate. Until they could gather with their family and friends, they decided to wait and believe the one who is God's incarnate.